Okay, we shall start the event for this evening. And hello, everyone, and welcome to the Princeton Young Ideas series. So this event has been launched last year, and actually this is our 10th event along the series. I'm Lin Shili, the Managing Director of Princeton University China office. And thanks all the online and offline audience for joining our event. And this initiative featuring the world-leading scholar and their most recent publication by Princeton, aiming to foster the global scholarly exchange between China and the West on the most cutting-edge topics. And so on behalf of the Princeton University Press, I want to give a very short introduction about our mission and vision in China. And PUP is the first and so far the only American university press opening an office in China dedicated to the two-way exchanges. We hope to publish the very best scholar in China and bring their perspectives to the attention of a global audience, especially in the West, and then bringing the English language works to the Chinese audience to foster global learning. And so we're very honored to have the legendary professor Max Bazerman to feature his recent PUP books, Negotiation. The game has changed. I just realized this is a Harvard professor published by Princeton and with the event in Yale Center. It's not very easy to get three of them in the same room. So I think this is a very delightful and very privileged evening. So Professor Bazerman is a pioneer in the field of negotiation and the J.C.A. Stroud Professor of Business Administration and Havard Business School. His many books, including Negotiation Genius, Negotiating Rationally, Complicity, How We Enable the Unethical and How to Stop, and Blind Spots, Why We Fail to Do What's Right and What to Do About It. So I want to give a very short introduction about this from these books. Negotiation, the game has changed. From bargaining in the street markets to complex business transactions and diplomatic negotiations between nations. Negotiations are everywhere and have a profound impact on our lives, work, and the world's most sophisticated operations. In today's world, full of uncertainty and major shocks, relying solely on intuition and experience is far from enough to reach effective agreements. Professor Bazerman is a leading expert in behavior economics and negotiation psychology at Harvard University, and is also a very famous author who has worked with the Princeton University Press for many years. And his newly published books, which she will offer the key insight this evening. In the book, he presents the state-of-art negotiation course. He elaborates on the core concepts and systematic frameworks of the universal negotiation, explaining how to tailor those principles to specific situations and discuss how to understand and respond to the irrational and irresponsible behaviors of negotiation counterparts. So this book not only helps readers understand the most important games happening in today's world in a very accessible way, but also serve as a timely business reference books. So enabling the readers to confidently achieve the win-win situation through negotiation in any environment. Okay, so that's the end of the advertisement. So I believe we will very much looking forward to learning more from Professor Bazerman today. And I will very happily welcome Carol Rafty, the Managing Director of the Yale Center in Beijing, to host today's event, also as our very distinguished discussant. Carol, just give the floor to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lingxi. And again, I want to thank Professor Max Bazerman, our speaker today, for waking up so early in his morning to join us for this event. I would also especially like to thank our Princeton University Press Beijing office team and Yale Center Beijing teams for making this unlikely but wonderful combination happen. Princeton, Yale, and Harvard. I will be the discussant, and I don't want to talk too long before Professor Bazerman starts his fascinating talk. I do want to welcome those of you, especially those of you who are new to Yale Center Beijing. We opened back in 2014 as Yale University's only university-wide center outside of its US campus, representing its 14 schools. So we're, in effect, a mini embassy that Yale University has in China. And throughout the year, we have interesting discussions and talks and concerts such as these happening throughout the year. And you're more than welcome to follow our social media accounts for further details on activities such as these. I very much look forward to this discussion because I've read this book cover to cover. And when I was at Stanford Law School, unfortunately, I wasn't able to go to Harvard Business School. But my favorite class at Stanford Law School was the negotiation workshop there. And I've heard of Professor Bazerman's work from there, as well as some of the concepts that he will be introducing in this book. So without further ado, let's welcome Professor Max Bazerman. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the kind introduction. I'm delighted to be at this Yale, Princeton, and perhaps Harvard event. And I think it's just great what Yale and Princeton are doing in China. So congratulations to you on all you've accomplished. So this is obviously a unusual time for a Harvard professor to be talking about negotiation to a Chinese audience. There's lots going on in the world. There's lots going on in terms of the current U.S. administration's negotiations with China. There's lots of strange things going on, including during today with Trump's announcements about his negotiations with Harvard University. So there's a tremendous amount going on, and yet I was invited here, I think, to primarily talk about my book, not about world politics. So my plan for the day is to give, for the evening, I should say, to give a talk based on my book, somewhat similar to other book talks that I've given. At the same time, I don't mean to censor any questions from the audience that might want to move to contemporary issues as well. So I'm deeply disturbed about some of the very unfortunate negotiations that are currently going on, and I don't mean to hide from those issues in any way whatsoever. But I think people came here for a talk on my book, and that's what I'm going to start with. And again, to open up to your questions during the Q&A period as you see kind of most appropriate. The kind introduction mentioned that this is really the third book that I've written on negotiations, and I've kind of been teaching negotiations most of my adult life. I first started teaching negotiations in 1984 when I was on the faculty at MIT. Soon thereafter, I moved to the Kellogg School at Northwestern University, where I was from 1985 to 1998. And I co-founded an executive program with Professor Jean Brett on negotiation strategies there, and then moved to Harvard. And by 2001, started an executive program called Changing the Game, which we've now offered over 60 times to almost 5,000 students. And I've taught an awful lot of MBA students as well. Along the way, as was mentioned, I wrote a couple of other books, Negotiating Rationally, which was published in 1992 with Professor Margaret Neal, and Negotiation Genius with Professor Deepak Malhotra in 2007. So this is really my third effort on the topic of negotiation. And you'll notice the subtitle, which is, I think, important to me. And the subtitle is The Game Has Changed. And to put some context into that, I've had many students who have taken an executive course from me, or perhaps an MBA course, and somewhere along the lines, I'll hear some comment that starts with, "This was a fine course," and then there's a but. And the buts could vary. It doesn't account for cultural norms. in the country that I'm negotiating with. It doesn't deal with the Chinese. We used to hear more about the Japanese, but whatever country is improving in its negotiation power typically gets listed there. When I travel overseas, I often hear how difficult it is to negotiate with Americans. Sometimes we'll hear about the unique economic environment. You're not dealing with the supply crisis that we're currently facing. How do you deal with irrational opponents, which we will get to later on in this talk? Negotiating over Zoom is different than negotiating in person. How does it deal with negotiating with my husband or wife? I saw my doctor yesterday for my annual physical, and she wanted to know, how do I get my patients to take their medicines, which I do consider a negotiation? And how do I negotiate with somebody who shows up, but I know, in fact, that they don't have the power to agree? So these are just, a handful of the dozens of buts that I've run into. And all of these questions are legitimate. And quite honestly, I think that historically I've said, but the course applies to your context. And I would talk about how the core concepts, which we'll talk about in a couple of slides, are relevant despite the unique circumstances. And I would talk to the person asking the question about their unique circumstances and try to apply the core concepts. But over recent years, I've become convinced that we need to take the context very seriously. And more and more, I think that the generic concepts that we've been teaching in negotiation, and you can see in Negotiating Rationally and Negotiation Genius, still apply in the current environment in whatever context we're facing. But I think that we need to take the context very seriously. So this book attempts to provide structures for thinking about how to take context seriously and also use more contemporary examples. And I'll give some, you'll see some of those as we go through the talk. But when I talk about the game has changed, here are some of the things that we can think about how the game has changed. The 9/11 attacks in the US very much reshaped our environment in a variety of dramatic ways. The Great Recession from 2007 to 2009 reshaped who has bargaining power. In the US, we've become a much more bifurcated society. We have a president that has approval ratings well below 30%, but yet still has very large amounts of power. But we have the majority of Americans who are not happy with most of what's going on in the current economy. As I'm now looking at a picture of this audience, and from my perspective, you're a young crowd, and you now are used to negotiating online, which people from my generation were caught by surprise that they needed to. A lot of people in my generation first started negotiating online when COVID hit. In 2020. Up until then, we thought of negotiation as a face-to-face interaction. This is not an item that I listed specifically for this audience. This is in my talk, my book talk, when I'm talking to other audiences as well. But the phenomenal growth of the Chinese economy has reshaped negotiations, and certainly we see that in terms of what's going on in the contemporary scene. We're negotiating with more and more people who are different than ourselves. So for a typical American, the typical American 30 years ago was a white male and was used to negotiating with white males. More and more, we're negotiating with people who are very different from ourselves. And finally, COVID-19, I think, reshaped who our trading partners were, created a lot of different changes. So in many ways, the world has changed. This doesn't mean that our old concepts are irrelevant. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what some of those old concepts are. And this is going to kind of be a very, very quick review of material that you could find in my prior books, Negotiating Rationally and Negotiation Genius. So I want to highlight, I'm not running away from these ideas at all. I think that they are relevant. It's just that we need to adapt them given how the world has changed. One of the most common concepts that people learn when they take a course on negotiation is this acronym BATNA. Just quickly, right now I can see the audience. Can you raise your hand if you've ever heard the concept of BATNA before? Okay, so just a few. Okay, so thank you for that. That's very helpful. The concept of BATNA, it's an acronym. It stands for Best Alternative to a Negotiated Agreement. And the basic idea here is, before you go into any important negotiation for the rest of your life, you should think long and hard about what are you going to do if you don't reach an agreement with your current opponent. So if you're negotiating for a job, it's very good to think long and hard about what are you going to do if you don't reach an agreement with this potential employee. Are you perfectly happy with your current job? Is staying in your current job a fine option? Do you have another job offer on the table? Or are you facing unemployment? Knowing your BATNA is very critical for thinking about how aggressive you want to be in your current negotiation. The better your BATNA, the tougher you can be. So that changes what we call a reservation point, or how far would you go in order to get an agreement done. Also important is the criticality of thinking about their BATNA. How badly do they need to get a deal done with you? What are they going to do if they don't reach an agreement with you? This gives you some hint about how far they can be pushed in this negotiation and what their reservation price is likely to be as well. And the difference between the two reservation points is what we call a zone of possible agreement. And the zone of possible agreement in a typical buyer or seller negotiation is the area between the lowest price the seller would ever take and the highest price that the buyer would ever pay. And now notice when we listen to a typical negotiation, we typically feel that there's a convergence to a point. But that point often exists within the context of a much broader range of what could have happened with different negotiation strategies by the two players who are at the table. In a typical negotiation simulation that I would use in teaching a group of executives, we'll pass out materials. Half the room will play buyers, half the room will play sellers. We'll match up a buyer with a seller, send them out of the room to find a quiet place to go negotiate, and then come back with their results. And all the buyers have the same material, all the sellers have the same material. But what's interesting is that there's a phenomenal range of results that the parties come back with. So different pairs of negotiators come back with dramatically different results, which surprises the executives because they thought they found the one point where they could both agree. In fact, that was one point within a much broader zone of possible agreement that was possible. So in teaching negotiations, the part of teaching negotiations that I enjoy the most is helping executives see the opportunity to create value or to break up what I call a mythical fixed pie. I've been teaching negotiations for over 40 years. And what I find most fascinating is that I'll run a simulation where the parties can create value by trading off two issues. That is, the buyer cares more about issue A, the seller cares more about issue B, and rather than compromising on A and B, they're both happier if the buyer gets what they want on A and the seller gets what they want on B. But often executives compromise on both issues. They don't find the gains from trade because they assume a mythical fixed pie. They assume that the pie is fixed. And they miss opportunities to create gains from trade. This is probably the most important opportunity that executives fail to see in their real life. They fail to find these gains from trade. So helping people create value so that the deal can be better for both sides is critical to helping people negotiate effectively. We also know that negotiators face a variety of systematic biases. We tend to be overconfident. We tend to escalate commitment to our prior course of action. So knowing what our systematic biases are is critically important, and thinking about the biases of other parties is very important as well. Now I'm going to talk about two more concepts from the background literature before I talk about some ways in which the games have changed. I'm going to talk a little bit about anchors and a little bit about 50-50 splits, because these are topics that I see in other important contemporary books on negotiation. So I want to integrate kind of what I think that I know. So there are a lot of people out there who might give you advice on the value of making an extreme anchor. And they will often have for you some story where they made an extreme offer and they ended up with a success. Okay. And my problem with these stories is that when you meet somebody at a party and they tell you about a story about a negotiation success, they very, very rarely tell you about the 3 failures that they also had in negotiation. And people who make extreme offers, they also end up blowing lots of deals where they could have had a deal had they been more reasonable. So we freeze people by making extreme offers, and we don't hear about their failures. So this selective storytelling that we hear from people gives us the idea that extreme offers can be effective. One example from the last Trump presidency was he demanded that Mexico pay for a wall separating Mexico from the United States. Not only did Mexico never pay for the wall, but it basically reduced the cooperation between those countries. So Mexico paid none of the costs associated with Trump's wall building activities, and we had worse trade relations as a result. Now, Adam Galinsky of Columbia University and Marie Schweitzer from the University of Pennsylvania, two well-known scholars, wrote a book called Friend or Foe, and they advocate for pretty extreme initial offers. The first offer should be just side of crazy as opposed to that side of crazy. I don't agree with that advice. I think that, again, the problem is that we hear selective stories. And we have evidence on the power of extreme anchors coming from classroom demonstrations where people are reluctant to come back to the class with no deal. And that helps make extreme offers more successful. In fact, I think that extreme offers mess up and prevent too many deals that should have been had. I think that the right answer is you want to anchor within the zone of possible agreement. That is, it's fine to be aggressive, but you want to make an offer within the range that is in fact viable. Another important topic is the idea of 50-50 splits. Many of you have been in negotiations where at some point the other side says, we're only $600 apart, why don't we just split the difference? And the question is, how should we respond to that? And to see the commonality of 50-50 splits, many of you have been in a restaurant where the two parties said, why don't we just split the bill? But one interesting question is, what if one person ate much more than the other person? Is a 50-50 split necessarily fair? When a parent passes away and leaves money to their children, should they each get 50%, or does it make sense to think about the needs of the different children? And finally, I have a dog. I'm married to Marla. and I have a dog. Her name's Becca. And sometimes we know that the dog needs 2 more walks today, and one of us will propose to do the 4 p.m. walk, and the other one will propose to do the 8 p.m. walk. Is that necessarily appropriate? And before you think, well, that seems pretty fair, but what if one of us is doing all the cooking during that time period? Perhaps we should trade off the dog walks for the cooking as we make a decision about how to think about this. Now, I want to tell you about 2 books that are written by other negotiation writers. One is Chris Voss, and his book has I find it an unfortunate title. It's called Never Split the Difference, and the book really isn't all that much about it, although he does provide some examples where splitting the difference doesn't make sense. And certainly I don't think you should always split the difference. But I think never splitting the difference is at a minimum a bit of an overstatement. And Yale professor Barry Nailbuff wrote a book called Split the Pie. And he argues a good way to go through life is to identify all the value that you're creating for the 2 parties and simply split the pie equally between the 2. And finally, I want to highlight the perspective of my former colleague at Northwestern, David Messick, who thinks about splitting the difference as a social heuristic. Now, heuristic is a word in the cognitive psychology literature for rule of thumb, like just sort of something that we do that works fine as a general rule to go through life. And what Messick argues is when we say, why don't we split the difference? He argues it's not a mechanism for finding something fair. It's a good mechanism to keep the parties from needing to haggle over what would be fair. So if you're in a restaurant and you've had a meal together, and the check comes and you say, let's split the difference, that's not because you ate the same amount. It's because there's something socially unpleasant by being so specific about who ate how much, that it's simply a nice way of going through social life to say, why don't we just split the difference? I think that these are all useful perspectives. Certainly, I don't agree with Voss that you should never split the difference. I think Nailbuff has a very interesting framework, and I think his book, Split the Pie, is a fine book to read. At the same time, there are times when I probably won't use that strategy, and I think it's useful to think about Messick's idea that, in fact, splitting the difference is more of a rule of thumb than anything else. Okay, so I want to talk about 2 aspects that are, I think, pretty unique to the book, having to do with ethics. So now I'm moving into how I think the game has changed. At the top of this slide, it reads, we've been searching for a new home, and a friend of ours is our real estate agent. We have always trusted her, but have noticed that she keeps advising us to make offers that are higher than we believe are reasonable. We are concerned that this serves her interest in getting a quick sale, but not our interest in getting as low a price as possible. Should we question her ability to offer us ethical advice? Should we listen to her advice? Should we even remain friends with someone whose advice would benefit her, but not necessarily us? And so this is a kind of question I often hear from people in the US. In the US, most residential real estate transactions occur through an agent, and an agent gets a commission on the sale of the house. And agents generally are better off if the buyer is willing to offer more and the seller is willing to take less. They basically want to get the deal done and move on to the next house. And what I find intriguing about this story, which I promise you I've heard many times, is that it fails to take into account that many of us are biased in a self-serving direction. It's not because we're bad people. It's not because we're dishonest. It's because we honestly believe we honestly believe the perspective that happens to be best for us. In a different version of this, Linda Babcock and George Lowenstein, professors at Carnegie Mellon University, did a study where they had law students play the roles of plaintiff and defendant attorneys on an accident case. So basically, a car hit a motorcycle. Everyone agrees that that the car driver is liable, and the question is, how much money should be paid to the plaintiff by the defendant to settle the case? And one of the things that they observe is that people playing the role of plaintiff honestly believe that the case should be settled at a higher price than the defendants believe. So by playing the role, they end up believing their perspective to a remarkable degree. Okay, and at the bottom of the screen, I'm sure that you've all been down there looking at this question. I asked sort of, what's your view about lying? You should never lie, you should rarely lie, you should avoid lying, but lies are often necessary in negotiation. Lying is simply a part of the negotiation process. And I want to highlight why I'm against lies and then clarify why my answer is number 2, as opposed to number 1, which would seem like a nicer response. So in 1962, which is a very long time ago, that's the time when the world came closest to a nuclear holocaust. In 1962, the Soviet Union had put nuclear missiles in Cuba that could easily hit the United States. The United States discovered that, and then we eventually saw the most important negotiation of my lifetime. Obviously, it's before most of your lifetimes, but we came very close to having a nuclear war. The solution to getting the missiles out of Cuba and ending the crisis was that the United States agreed to take our nuclear missiles out of Turkey that could also be aimed at the Soviet Union. So there was a trade to remove weapons of mutual destruction aimed at the two countries, which I would argue is far better for the world than no agreement. Part of the story was that the Kennedy administration, President Kennedy of the United States, would look weak if he admitted to taking the missiles out of Turkey. And the Kennedy administration deceived the American public and claimed that the Turkish missiles were not part of the deal, that the United States simply decided 6 months later to remove the missiles. Now, that lie may well have saved the world from nuclear holocaust. And if I can save the world for one small lie, that seems like a pretty good deal. Most of the time, you can't get that. And what you get from lying instead is you destroy the opportunity to create value. You destroy relationships. You destroy the opportunity to create value over time. So I think that lying interferes with value creation and is generally a very bad strategy. At the same time, if we could get extraordinary benefits for the world, then I think it may be worth it. So I think it's important to think about why not to lie. And my reason is it destroys value. Occasionally, we might run into a situation where value could be created, as we saw in the Kennedy story. Okay, I think I'm going to skip that one. Okay, so I want to highlight here that if we go back not very long ago, 30 years ago, and you wanted to book a hotel room in the United States for a vacation, it was a very complicated process, okay? You might use a travel agent, you might make a telephone call, but if you think about making a hotel reservation in a different city or in a different country, before the online economy existed, it was a dramatically different place. Today, we book hotel rooms in other countries in a small number of minutes with a small number of clicks with a bunch of search engines that help us find good deals and the like. it's a dramatically different world. I'd say up until COVID, most salespeople believed in the importance of negotiating face to face. When COVID hit, we found out that wasn't going to happen anymore. And we found out that teaching face to face wasn't going to happen. So we learned to teach online, we learned to negotiate online. And Terry Kurtzberg, a professor at Rutgers University, has done really terrific work highlighting that there's so many decisions that we make about negotiating online without even thinking about it. Some of you quickly use your cell phone in order to conduct the online negotiation. And Kurtzberg's research convinces me that having a larger monitor with greater clarity is important. To not be multitasking when you're negotiating is absolutely critical. If you have a partner on the negotiation from your organization and you're negotiating with other people and you're in different locations, thinking in advance about who's going to say what when is critically important. To realize that you need a back channel to communicate to your negotiation partner, again, is critically important. So this is a way in which the negotiation environment of today is fundamentally different than negotiation in the past. Okay, so I now want to just tell you about a few different negotiations where we can think about how to change the game. So rather than accepting the game as it is, we can think about how to change the game. All of these are going to be true stories. So story number one happened a few years ago. Basically, a friend of mine put her condo on the market in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and she thought that her condo was worth about between $1 million and $1.1 million. The market was very attractive to sellers at the time, and the agent convinced her that it would be wise to put her house on the market at a slightly low price, where the idea was to create many bidders who would make offers to create a bidding war. And I don't necessarily agree with this strategy, but this is what the seller did. And then the interesting part of the story occurs. Okay, so she put her house on the market with an open house scheduled for Sunday. So she put the house on the market. I believe it was on Thursday, and by Friday, I received an email, and the email basically asked for advice. And the reason for the advice was that the plan had been to have an open house on Sunday to let lots of people see it, and then get offers by early the next week. The problem was that somebody had made a very attractive offer for $1.125 million, but they put a short deadline on the offer, demanding a yes or no answer from the seller, or otherwise the offer would expire on Sunday night before the other offers were likely to come in. And the real estate agent, consistent with an earlier slide, was very enthusiastic about the seller either taking the 1.125 or countering it with a bit more, but basically trying to reach an agreement pretty quickly. And as negotiation professor, my friend said, what do you think I should do? And I borrowed from an idea from my colleague Guhan Subramanian, who's also a professor at the Harvard Business School. And it comes from the merger environment. And it's a strategy called Go Shop. And what I proposed to her was that she requests that the prospective buyer make their offer legally binding through the following Wednesday rather than expiring on Sunday. But in return, offer the buyer a chance to beat the best offer that the sellers receive by $25,000 if they receive a higher offer by Wednesday. And if no offer arrives, the seller would commit to accepting the current offer. Now, if you think about this, this is kind of an intriguing set of ideas that I borrowed from Guhan. Again, he talks about this in the context of companies in a merger environment. But the basic idea is that it gives the buyer the assurance that if they want to pay the fair market value for the condo, they can buy it. It gives the seller the opportunity to find out what the market is, and it basically binds the contract in a way that will work. My friend adjusted my suggested final offer premium down from $25,000 to $10,000, and then basically made this counter offer implementing the idea, and then put the house on the market, had the open house on Sunday, generated other offers. And in fact, the highest offer they got was 1.2 million, which they used to go back to the original buyer who said, yes, I'll pay the 1.21 million. And they basically were able to take that. So this is an interesting opportunity. Rather than saying yes or no to the 1.125 or countering it with a slightly different offer, this provided the buyer with an opportunity to explore the market. Okay, now, since we have Princeton University Press sitting right here with us in the audience, I thought I'd share with you my negotiations with them, because authors need to negotiate with a publishing house. And I want to talk about some interesting ways in which the game might change. So when I was negotiating the contract for my prior book with Princeton University Press, Complicit, the book had a significant amount of demand. I had 5 different publishers who were interested in publishing Complicit. I tend to do my negotiations myself. I tend to not use an agent or a lawyer. Other authors handle that very differently. While I'm running essentially an auction for the book, I think I know basically the price level that we're headed toward in terms of the auction. And for a variety of reasons, I decided Princeton University Press is the right press for me. Now, the problem with running an auction, you might end up with the highest bidder not being the party that you most want to end up with as your partner in the complicated process of publishing a book. So at some point, I adjusted the procedure. Again, my colleague Guhan Subramanian has an interesting word for it. He calls it a negotiation. Basically, in the middle of the auction, I basically took the price that Princeton had on the table, and I said, if you add 20% to it, I'll end the negotiation now without going back to any of the other publishers. And they said, can you give us a half hour to talk internally? I said, sure. And they came back and they took that deal. So basically, I changed the process because I developed a preference for who I ended up negotiating. Now, the details of contracts are also important. And I have to say that while I generally like having fewer additional parties involved, and I think I can generally read a contract reasonably well despite the lack of a law degree, it is true that I was a little bit sloppy here. And I signed a contract with Princeton, not realizing the clause that you can see in the bottom half of this slide. And basically, what this clause did was it gave Princeton the sole opportunity to negotiate with me exclusively for a period of time, specifically a 60-day period that was spelled out pretty clearly on my next book. Now, I honestly didn't notice that I had agreed to this paragraph, but when I was writing my next book, the one that you see sitting in front of the room right now, I basically looked at my complicit contract. I don't even remember why, and I saw this particular term. And quite honestly, I was a little bit disappointed. I was planning on, going out and running an auction on my negotiation book. Um, but after I had changed the terms of how we were going to negotiate complicit, what I found is that Princeton University Press had a very intriguing strategy for affecting the negotiation of the next book. Of course, I followed the agreement that I had signed, and Princeton made me a generous offer on negotiation of the game has changed, and I ended up signing with them again quite happily. So it ended up working out reasonably well. Now, finally, this is going to be kind of the final piece that I'm going to talk about. And some of you might know the name Daniel Kahneman, often credited with creating the world of behavioral economics. About a decade ago, I spent a lot of time working with Kahneman on a consulting project for a very big insurance company. And we developed a variety of negotiation programs for this insurance company. And the thing that we kept on running into is we would be told, we're reasonable, the other side isn't. How do we negotiate with an unreasonable alternative party? Now, I should describe the insurance negotiation context a little bit. So assuming an insurance company covers you for some possible problem that might occur, the problem occurs, and then the insurance company says, we'll give you $1 million to solve that problem. And you, the plaintiff, the claimant says, no, this is worth $10 million. Now, unlike negotiating a new business deal, where if you don't reach a deal, you can each go your own way and negotiate with other people on other deals instead. In an insurance claim, kind of like a lawsuit, if you aren't able to reach an agreement, the eventual resolution procedure is that you go to court, and a court decides what the fair price would be for that claim. And the question we kept on running into from this insurance company is, how do we deal with claimant attorneys who are making demands that are 10 times anything reasonable? And what we developed for this insurance company, and I describe in Negotiation of the Game has Changed, is something called the Final Offer Arbitration Challenge. Now, I'm going to give you a little bit of background on this idea by telling you about the history of this idea and its use in sports in the US, and then I'll talk about it as a more general procedure for how to get reasonable people how to get unreasonable people to come to the table. So Carl Stevens was a labor relations expert in the 1960s, and he actually invented the term final offer arbitration. And it was in response to the idea, actually I should describe arbitration. So arbitration is a process by which party A and party B, instead of going to court, agree to go to a wise third party, tell them their positions, for example, what the wage should be, whether it should be $10 an hour or $16 an hour. And the arbitrator has the power, like a judge, to decide what's fair. And a problem that existed in the labor relations literature in the 1960s is that many saw arbitrators not as wise people, but as people who pretty routinely split the difference between the last two positions that they heard. So if the union said $16 an hour is fair and the management says $10 an hour is fair, you end up with $13 an hour. Now, many of you can start to think about how you might game that. And instead of going in with 16, maybe you want to go in with 20. That way, when they split the difference between 10 and 20, you end up with 15, which is better than splitting the difference between 10 and 16. So one of the problems with arbitration is that if you plan on an arbitration, you could imagine wanting your position to be as extreme as possible. So Stevens invented this idea of final offer arbitration, where the arbitrator wouldn't split the difference. In fact, they couldn't split the difference. They would be required to take one of the two offers on the table, ideally the one that is fairest. So if you get 10 and 16, you have to decide 10 or 16, not 13. Now, why would that be good? And the quick answer is, when people are subject to final offer arbitration, they're afraid of losing the arbitration, and they end up negotiating deals rather than actually going through the arbitration process. So the final offer arbitration process is there. It's invoked, but people settle before they get to the actual arbitration procedure. So the most visible American example of the use of final offer arbitration is in our sport, baseball, where players and teams in a certain category of players, if they're unable to reach an agreement on their own, they're allowed to file for final offer arbitration. And once they do, over 90% of the cases that are filed then settle, because the parties are afraid of losing in final offer arbitration, so they become more reasonable. And when they do go to final offer arbitration, instead of being at 10 and 16, they end up at 1240 versus 1260. That is, the offers come much closer to conversion. So so the idea of a final offer arbitration challenge is, we may not need the institution for this. If you're having a dispute with somebody, and you need to work with them in the future, so walking away isn't really an option, but you're having trouble getting any kind of resolution, and any judicial process would take a long time, perhaps you could basically propose to them, why don't we both submit our offers to a wise party? In the US, we have the American Arbitration Association to provide arbitrators, but you could imagine even finding a mutually agreeable, wise person who will listen to the two arguments, look at the two final offers, and then select which of the two is more appropriate. Okay, so all of these ideas are developed in my book. The negotiation of the game has changed. It's hard for me to know exactly what's on your minds, so I think I'll end a few minutes ahead of schedule so we have more time for discussion with you and questions from the group, and I'll look forward to learning from you in the next phase of our program.
Thank you very much, Professor Bazerman, for this wonderful talk. I will start off with a couple questions, one that is more pertinent to the book and the subject matter, and another that's more contemporary. To start off our Q&A interaction and as you might see, the audience has been spilling off the regular seats as well. So, and everyone is finding your talk riveting. I'll start off with the first question. So after reading your book, and by the way, I recommend everyone read it. And we are selling them, not we are, but the Princeton University Press is selling the book at the venue as well, if you're interested in getting a book after this talk. So after reading the book, one question I have in my mind, and you just mentioned it close to the end of your discussion about your work with Danny Kahneman and behavioral economics. The impression, and it could be erroneous, my impression from the book is that there are certain heuristics that we may want to take into account for when we engage in negotiations, so that I guess we approach negotiations more with rationality rather than with emotions, and kind of reach the best possible outcome and create the most value for all sides. But the question I wish to pose to you is if you think there are situations where, or if there might be areas where emotions may come in handy in creating value for negotiations and outcomes.
Sure. So first of all, I'm going to elaborate a little bit on your question, and then we can come back to the question that you ended up with. So there's a whole field of behavioral economics which focuses on the systematic and predictable biases that affect our own judgment. And I would say that we want to be aware of those biases in our decision making. This is a topic that's covered in this book, but it's also covered in my two prior books on negotiation as well. And we also highlight the fact that the other side can also be systematically biased, and we want to be aware of that. In my limited number of comments, I focused on a couple of those biases. I focus on the fact that we assume that the pie is fixed even when there's opportunities for gains from trade. I focused on our failure to think about the perspective of the other side. These are biases that we want to overcome. In Kahneman's wonderful book, Thinking Fast and Slow, he distinguishes between system one and system two thinking. And system one is your intuitive decision-making processes, the first thing that comes to your mind, your first reaction. System two is your more deliberative thinking, when you think about the pros and cons of each course of action, when you do whatever decision analysis might be appropriate, when you check in with your smart friend to ask them what they think. Those are all system two processes. And I'll quickly say that across lots of contexts, in negotiation and otherwise, there's good reason to believe system two leads to better decisions than system one. Okay, so if I have to pick a basic process, I want to move people from system one, intuitive processes, to system two. Are there situations where you want the other side to know that you really are angry and upset by the fact that you've discovered that they've been lying to you about their interests? Sure. Okay. So I think we can easily identify situations where we want people to understand sort of our emotional reaction. If you're negotiating with your romantic partner, do you want them to know that they've upset you very much? Sure. So that there could be legitimate content. On the other hand, do we want to sort of start and finish with our emotional reaction, which is going to be part of our system one thinking? I think not. I think that we often escalate to emotional conflicts in ways that are long-term dysfunctional. So I don't mean to deny the reality of our emotional reaction. Do we want to convey that at times to the other side? Yes, but we want to realize that the wise resolution is going to probably come by moving toward our system two, more deliberative processes.
That's very helpful to know. Thank you. And my second question is more contextual and contemporary about how you, if the Chinese government were to reach out to you to become a consultant in its negotiations with the Trump administration, what would be your advice on some potential strategies to approach their approaches? Thank you.
Sure. So we could almost substitute Chinese government for Harvard University, because both of these entities are having trouble with the Trump administration. And to the extent that anybody is bullying you, should you give in? The answer is generally no. You don't want to reward people for extreme aggressive behavior. And there's been a lot written recently about the Trump administration suggesting that after Trump makes very extreme demands, he often ends up backing off when he can't get what he wants and then declaring victory anyhow. And, and certainly we can see some of that in terms of putting 145% tariff on Chinese products, which he then backed off on with some kind of sort of deal that was made behind the scenes between the two governments. And I think that we make a real mistake if we give in to into people making very extreme demands. And I find some of the extreme tariff demands to be unfortunate, bad for the U.S., bad for the world, bad for the other side. We've been talking about value creation. Overall, extreme barriers and extreme tariffs are bad, reduce value. And free trade is one of the most important things that we need to consider. So, are there things that Trump might be saying that Harvard should do differently that make sense? That's certainly possible. Should Harvard think about how it's been managing independent of the Trump administration? Absolutely. Should the Chinese government think about whether they've had too many barriers to products from other countries? Sure, they should. So is it possible that the Chinese government has engaged in decisions in the past that aren't optimal for creating a free trade environment? That's certainly possible. But should you give in to extreme demands from Trump or any other extremist opponent? The answer is generally no. What that will get you is more extreme demands in the future. We don't want to reward bad behavior. We basically want to call bad behavior for what it is and then reset the negotiation, which hopefully is what we will move toward in terms of U.S.-China relations moving forward.
Thank you very much for sharing your insights.